Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the honor of hosting Professor Rachel Wicaksono, who is a professor of TESOL and Applied Linguistics and head of the School of Education, Language and Psychology at York St. John University in the UK. She has taught English, trained teachers, inspected programs, and led courses and schools in Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Vietnam, Malaysia, China, Japan, Thailand, and Sweden. In 2013, she was awarded a Higher Education Academy National Teaching Fellowship for her work on the internationalization of higher education. She has been a member of the British Association for Applied Linguistics Executive Committee since 2017 and is currently Membership Secretary. Thank you so much for being with us here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chanel. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your help with organising this talk, and Phoebe too. I'm really honoured to be invited to speak to this group, a very prestigious group of scholars known for their boundary-breaking thinking, and that makes me a bit nervous. Anissa has very kindly helped with a breathing exercise, so that was very enjoyable and helpful in preparation for this session. But it really is a great honour to be here, and I'll try and say a couple of things that might be of interest based on some work and some thinking that me and my colleagues here at York St John University in the UK have been doing for the last few years. So I hope there's something of interest. I think, as we've already said, the best bit is going to be the discussion at the end. So I'll stick to time to make sure that we have plenty of time for that discussion. All right, so I'm going to try and share my screen with you now, and hopefully you can see the title slide there. So if Chanel, if you just give me a thumbs up.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so as Chanel said, and as the abstract promises, my topic today is ontologies of English in applied linguistics in teaching English to speakers of other languages and beyond. And as Chanel has just said, I work at York St John University, which is in the north of England. It's a small university. It's a widening participation university, so that might be considered a sort of low status thing. We work with undergraduates mainly, who are often first in family to go to university from groups and parts of the country that might be considered as sort of lower economic, socioeconomic status. So we're originally a teacher education college, teacher training college, established in 1841. So we're very proud of our contribution to the local economy, to local education. And what we think of as social justice has always been sort of quite close to our hearts, in the sense of working with the community to improve opportunities, especially for young people in the local and regional area in which we're situated. So that's York St John. All right, so in the first part of this talk, I'm going to outline a framework that we've developed here at York St John, me working with Professor Chris Hall. I'll come back to the work that we've done with Chris in a bit more detail later. So I'm going to outline a framework that's designed to map ontological commitments to English, meaning what people think English is, or how English might be construed or conceptualized by a variety of different individuals and groups. And that's not a new question, as obviously, as you will all know, and many of you, including Professor McConey, have been leading thinkers in this area now for several decades. So it's not a new question, but certainly for somebody from my background, which is English language teaching, it's still a question, I think, which needs, it's a question whose profile continues to need to be raised. Certainly the first few years of my English language teaching career, it never crossed my mind to think about what this thing was that I was supposed to be teaching. I was kind of obsessed with how to teach, with methods, with techniques, with materials design. And these are interesting and important questions, but it was only really after about 10 years of teaching that I started to think, for various different reasons, hang on, what is this thing? There doesn't seem to be agreement on what it is. What is this thing? What's the content that I'm supposed to be teaching? So it's a question, the question of what English is and what named languages are, or what language is, has been addressed. And I'll go briefly into some of the ways in which scholars, some of the sort of angles which scholars have taken on that question of what English is in a minute. I also want to focus, in fact, for most of the talk, on the so what question, because I position myself very firmly within applied linguistics. So Chanel kindly mentioned that I'm a member of BAL, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, and I've been the BAL membership secretary. So if any one of you interested in joining BAL, I can happily talk to you about the advantages and how to join. But that identity of applied linguist is very important to me, and that so what question. Once we've figured out a way of sort of framing these different ways of conceptualizing what English is, what are we going to do with that? What does that mean for individuals and groups in education? And also I'll talk a little bit about how I've worked in a transdisciplinary way recently with psychotherapists and with museum staff, so conservators who work in a museum context. And that's really all because I really am most interested in the so what question. What are we going to do? We're a problem-solving discipline in applied linguistics. So what are we going to do about that? So second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about 4 case studies in which the consideration of what things are, that ontological question, played a part in that case study. So I'm going to talk about a project called Changing Englishes, a project called York's Hidden Stories, some work that I did with a psychotherapist colleague, and a museum conservation project. And then at the end, I'll try and maybe speculate on where I might go next, or where some of those questions and answers might go next. Okay. All right. So what is English? What is this thing that we refer to as English? It's a question, as I said, that has been asked, including by some members of this community, scholars working in a variety of paradigms, from world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, translanguaging, and most recently post-humanist applied linguistics. From my practical sort of background as an English language teacher, as I said earlier, it was sort of a question that wasn't even answered, because it was assumed that English was sort of non-controversial. It was related to something that happened, strongly associated with political boundaries, strongly associated with the concept of native speaker, and strongly associated with the idea of norms, and a monolithic view of English as something with a centre and with boundaries, beyond which were errors and incorrect language. And that's the tradition, I think, which is still pretty strong in a lot of English language teaching around the world. And that's certainly where I started. In our current work with English language teachers at York St John, those teachers can often see that what happens outside of the classroom is very different from what they teach inside of the classroom. So many of the teachers have an awareness that their ideal of English as a monolith is a sort of Platonic ideal, not something that has much of an existence outside the very narrow confines of the class, and particularly assessment of their content. Nonetheless, it's still a pretty strong view. So I'm going to go on to my next slide, and that's just a reference to a book chapter. Colleagues working on currently working on the Routledge Handbook of Teaching English as an International Language, Nicola Galloway and Ali Fuad Selvi, asked me, and Hall CJ is Chris Hall, to contribute a chapter on Ontologies of English and International Language. And in that we review these different ways of thinking, these different traditions in linguistics and applied linguistics of thinking about what English is, including those sort of maybe lay ontologies that I've mentioned already that are typical of much English language teaching around the world, lay ontologies or folk linguistics, monolithic ideas about what English is. We also, of course, talk about developments since the 1980s in world Englishes, in which, as you'll all be very familiar, varieties of English were recognized for having their own status and coherence, a sort of pluricentric approach to what English is, but again, quite strongly associated with national boundaries. So we review that work on world Englishes, and then we move on to English as a lingua franca, where the interest was less on geography and genetics and more on use, particularly where people were speaking English and from different perspectives, in the sense of different language backgrounds. What was that thing that got used then? And we trace a little bit of the history of English as a lingua franca, from starting with still quite monolithic ideas about a code, a core, and that's based on the brilliant work that the World Englishes scholars did, that really interesting work, which changed certainly my thinking when I was reading it at the time about what English was. And we trace the shift from that still perhaps quite monolithic thinking, where there's still a core, that gradually got eroded, I think, in terms of the work that those scholars who were working within the English as a lingua franca paradigm were doing, as corpus linguistics helped us to see that the idea of the core is an ideal, and in fact the English that gets used, particularly in these cosmopolitan contexts, is highly variable and very varied. And we talk about gradually how that tradition has moved towards a more sort of English as a social practice idea, in which work on translanguaging, translingual practice is done. But before I talk about that bit, I'll just while I'm talking about English as a lingua franca, and just for sort of sentimental reasons, want to show you a tiny bit of data that I recorded back in, I think it was about 2010. And this transcript is a conversation in the class, in a classroom, between two students at York St John. We've got Ollie O, who is classified as a home student, so he's born and brought up in the UK, and then we've got S in line, who comes in line 4 there, Stavros, who was classified as an international student. Stavros's other languages included Greek. as well as English. So Ollie and Stavros were having this conversation about their educational experiences at York St John, and Ollie starts in line 1 asking a question of Stavros about the lessons that Stavros is having, and asks whether which bit Stavros has enjoyed. And then you can see there's some micro pauses in there represented by the dots in brackets. So maybe Ollie is sort of accommodating Stavros here, who is positioned by the institution and probably by me in the way that I introduce these students to each other as an international student, and with all of the related assumptions about the English language so-called competence of international students. Anyway, so in line 4, you can see it's quite a long pause, 2 seconds, and Stavros says, and then Ollie has another go. So he relaunches that question. There's an a lip smack, the LS, another second pause, and then Ollie switches. He started with lessons in line 1, and he switches, he substitutes in line 6, foundation program for lessons. So he has another go at this question, but he's switched a word, again, perhaps accommodating Stavros, looking for a word or a phrase that might be perhaps more considered by Ollie more familiar with Stavros. Anyway, it turns out, rather humorously, in line 8, I think, that the sort of the problem, if you like, is not a language problem, it's a content problem. Ollie had assumed that I was teaching Stavros, and Stavros says, no, we don't have Rachel, she's not teaching. And then Ollie has another go, third go at the question. So it's a piece of data that was collected as a part of a project I did in around about 2010. And that was when I was thinking about what English as a lingua franca was and what the features were, but also noticing how assumptions of competence, perceptions of proficiency were working through the ways that students accommodated each other in their classroom talk. And this was very consistent with the thinking at the time in English as a lingua franca, that it was often the people using or very familiar with English as a lingua franca who were the expert users of English as a lingua franca. And I remember writing about this. I wrote about it in 2012, and that was one of my conclusions, was that all the effort that universities put into teaching international students is often completely misguided, because they're the ones that come with the experience to be able to be successful in a multilingual environment. And in fact, it was the home students at York St John, anyway, first in family, often not monolingual, hadn't had the opportunity to travel very much. It was often they were the ones that perhaps were in need of the extra teaching. In fact, they didn't get it. The international students got the extra teaching. But anyway, so that was a little bit of data from that old project. So English lingua franca, as you will all know, sort of evolved the thinking there to more thinking of English as a social practice, and of language use generally as context sensitive, adaptive, idiosyncratic, and building on, again, a well-established tradition in sociolinguistics on accommodation, going back to the 1970s or 60s, 70s and 80s, in which language use is described as languaging. And parallel work, of course, going on in psycholinguistics, which looked at the storage in the brain of looked at multilingual brains, and saw that languages are not stored separately, but they're integrated systems. So yes, translingual practice, English or language use as person, context, situation, time, specific, emerging in specific, flexible and unpredictable ways. English or language as a verb rather than a noun, or Englishing. We talk in the previous chapter that I showed you there, we move on, and it was a strain for us in our thinking, but we were determined to move on and try to incorporate some more recent thinking in post-humanist applied linguistics, in which English is the boundaries between language and other semiotic resources in our environment are starting to be, I think, very helpfully challenged and blurred. And in this book, which is on the screen now, we were honoured to receive a contribution by your colleague, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, who talks in this book, as he has elsewhere, about flat ontologies, where all resources work collaboratively. Language and other semiotic resources in the environment work collaboratively in the construction of meaning and activity, changing each other in that process. So post-English or post-language ontologies. Anyway, so what we are doing in this ontological thinking is not necessarily new, but I think what we've tried to contribute is some kind of framework to help linguists, applied linguists, but also colleagues from outside linguistics sort of frame their thinking about what English is, what language is, and more broadly, as I'll show you at the end, what things in general are. And so I'll just show you the framework on the next slide. So this is from the book which I've just shown you. This is on page 16, and this is in a chapter that's not written by me. I hasten to add, it's written by my colleague Chris Hall, and who loves a diagram. He's famous for his diagrams, and rightly so, because they're a very useful way of thinking through the complex, sometimes sort of mess of what we think language might be. So he's very clear that this is not a sort of rigorous ontological theory, but it's a sort of framework for discussion. A suggestive marker, he calls it, on page 16 of that book. So you can see here, and he goes into some detail in the chapter. He's got 4 different domains here, 4 different ways or 4 different categories for thinking about what language is. And some of these are relevant to the types of thinking that I've already mentioned. So I'll just really briefly go through, I'll try and go through these. But so starting with the cognitive domain, then I'll go on to the expressive domain, notional, and then social. Okay, so in the cognitive domain, you can see I language and the language capacity. Language capacity meaning the idea that humans have a capacity for language, and it's something that's situated in our minds and brains. And I language meaning I for idiolect, the distinct and unique set of linguistic resources that we have, all slightly different from each other based on our acquisition and use experiences with language. So that's idiolect. In the expressive domain are the products of those idiolects, of those I languages, the tokens or specific instances of language and the types, genres, for example. The uses, the specific uses recorded in the form of transcriptions, for example, documents, corpora, etc. And in medium, still in the expressive domain, the physical tokens of those expressions of language, speech, sign, or writing. In the notional domain, we've got idealized I language and P language. P meaning a Platonic language, the idea that there is some perfect English, often referred to as standard English, out there, and independent of actual instantiations of language in people's minds. Idealized I language, abstracted from the actual expressions of language that are in the expressive domain. And then finally, I think I've come around now to the social domain. We've got N language and languaging. N language stands for norms, named national languages, the idea that English is a standardized language associated, for example, with national borders, including England, and associated with so-called native speakers. And then on the other side of things, really, within the social domain, we've got languaging, which I referred to earlier when I was talking about sort of translingual, translanguaging practices, the idea that that's all we've got, that nothing else that I've talked about here is kind of relevant, that there is only use, and you know, that is what language is. It's just use. It has a performative and it does things, has a performative function. It does things, it does identities, it creates our world. So languaging, I'm sure, something that all of you are sort of pretty familiar with as an idea. Yeah, so that is a quick tour around that ontological framework for language. And as Chris says in that chapter, it's a thinking sort of tool, if you like. And we came to the need for this in a project that actually I'll go on to when I talk about the case study. So I'll just quickly talk about the applied linguistics bit. I think I've already done this because I've said that I strongly identify as an applied linguist, a sort of so what person. Patrick is a colleague at the University of Texas, Chris and I at York St John, and we're working on the third edition of this at the moment, and working on incorporating some of this later thinking about what English is and what language is generally, and what the impact of that might be in the language professions, like speech and language therapy, like translation, like literacy, like additional language education. Anyway, this was our definition. It's a definition based on the famous definition, Chris Brumpett's famous definition, but that the and is italicized. Oh, sorry, the and is italicized there because it's the action for me that's the super important bit. Yeah, I hope the case studies will show the relevance to people's lives and professional working lives of the work, the thinking that we've done about ontologies. And I've just realized that I can't see the clock on my screen, so I had turned my phone off. so that it didn't beep, but I'm going to turn it back on. All right. Okay. All right. So, okay, this is the first of 4 of the case studies. This is Changing Englishes, and it's an online course. It's free to access. It's published under Creative Commons license. So please feel free to point anybody who you think might benefit from it to this material. It's free to use, to repurpose, if you think it might be of interest to any of the language teacher educators that you work with. Anybody who completes the course gets a certificate from York St John, if that's of interest. And we wrote this course. This one is also in redevelopment. We're hoping to relaunch it next year, but we wrote this course after many years of working on our MA TESOL here at York St John, and doing a really interesting project with some of our alumni who had gone back to their jobs in China to teach English, and with their help we interviewed and surveyed quite a large number of English language teachers in Chinese universities about their conceptualization of English. And so here, this is quite early in our thinking. We were keen to broaden out perhaps the teacher's conceptualization of what English is, from more of a monolithic, which I've referred to as quite traditional maybe way of thinking about what English is, to more of a pluralitic, fuzzy boundaries, no core, etc. And we did this because we noticed, as I said earlier, that when we taught to students, often their conceptualization of English was very much that P language, the idea that there was sort of a standard out there, but they didn't know where or exactly what it was, because their own experience of English language use, particularly younger colleagues, was on the internet, where all sorts of Englishes are successfully and happily used. So we built this course with those alumni and with their colleagues to try and explore their conceptualizations of English and the impact of a different way, possible different ways of thinking about what English is on teaching, and for example, in terms of error correction, or in terms of testing, and in terms of education policy. So that is case study 1. Case study 2 is this one. This is also a student at York St John University. In fact, Dasha, this student, she was a so-called international student, and she did the foundation program together with Stavros. And then she carried on to do our BA English Language and Linguistics, and later a Master's by Research. And this is a result of that project. We published that work. And in this book, I'm starting, and with Dasha, starting to broaden out the benefit, I think, of thinking about not just what English is or what language is, but what things are more generally. And the thing that we looked at in this book was interviews, research interviews. That was our thing. So we tried to look at different ways of understanding what the research interview is. And we developed a framework for mapping various different conceptualizations of what interviews are, from post-positive or romantic notions about you ask and they answer, romantic notions of build up a rapport and really get to the bottom of what this person means, to more social constructivist ideas of interviewers and interview data being produced in interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. And we did a lot of conversation analysis to show how the interview was a co-construction, to moving on to more transformative ways of conceptualizing interview data. If it's a co-construction, then what is the interviewer's responsibility to the story and the life of the interviewee, particularly in this case when we were involved in interviewing people who might be considered quite vulnerable, people with not very strong, or not allowed to have, not given a platform for their stories to be told. So yeah, so we broadened out that thinking about what things are into thinking about what interviews are. And we, again, another website, and also Creative Commons, but some of the data that we collected and our analysis is on there, and some of our recommendations for thinking about interviews and using interviews in the type of community project that we were doing are on there. So yeah, please, by all means, if you think that might be useful, feel free to use that. Third of the four case study was some very recent work with my colleague Professor Divine Sharua. You can see that reference there, Sharua D, Divine. Divine is a psychotherapist, a counselling psychologist and psychotherapist, and he does a lot of work with trauma and with refugees and asylum seekers that have experienced trauma. And he uses objects and photographs in his work, both in his research and his professional practice. So here in this chapter, we talk about those objects that the refugees and asylum seekers bring to the counselling sessions and bring to the research, the data collection sessions. And so Divine uses an example of a pair of shoes, and talks about understandings of what those shoes are, because they're multiple things, that they're not, there's no just their shoes, but they're multiple things. And he unpicks those multiple, the multiple ways of being that those shoes have, and starting to move in a post-humanist direction, how the shoes are influencing the conversation that happens in the therapy room and in the data collection. So the shoes are not merely a passive object, but they're they have agency and they contribute to his professional practice and his research. And I, in that chapter, talk a little bit about going back to interview data, but what data is in research, yeah, and how that is not a passive thing. It's not a thing that already exists. No, that's kind of obvious, but it gets created through the way we measure it, through the way we present it, and through the way we use it in our research writing. So that's the third one. And the final one is this project with Matthew Reed, who is a museum, he's a horologist, clocks and historic dynamic objects conservator. And this is a picture of an 18th century mechanical swan. It's an automaton. And so you can wind it up, and its neck, it's a shame I haven't got a video. You can see videos online of this swan moving, and there's music. It's a really beautiful thing. But Matthew and I took the framework that Chris had developed, and we tweaked it a bit with Chris's help into something that we thought might be useful for people who work in museums with objects, who, you know, are custodians or carers of those objects, particularly his profession, conservation. How do you start the conservation of an object? Well, obviously you need a conceptualization of what that object is before you start to make changes to it. And so Matthew's argument was that in the past, perhaps a bit like with me in English language teaching, conservators have sort of have gone in and repaired what they have not completely thought through what they've conceptualized as damage, but damage is just change. Dirt, which often gets cleaned away or polished, is just information. So we tried to develop this ontological framework for museum conservators to really get a conversation going about what objects are before conservators start their work. So we developed Chris's framework, and we came up with a few questions. These are just examples. There's about 13 questions, but just to get dialogue going in a museum between curators and conservators, but also between the funders, between the owners, perhaps, of the objects, and very importantly, between visitors, not necessarily the ones that can get to go and see these objects, but all over the world who might interact with these objects digitally. So here are some examples of questions that we thought might be useful to sort of spark a debate on what things are. And there are many others. And finally, this is where I'm going to finish. This project hasn't started yet, but this is a bike workshop in York, where I live, that does community projects, and I'm about to. I think that our local council is going to fund some workshops, some bike maintenance workshops for a group of asylum seekers that have been moved by our Westminster government to York, about 250 asylum seekers who arrived in York before Christmas, so they've been here for some time. I really need to get going with this project, but what the project will be working with those, inviting members of that group to come and get a bike. So they'll have a one-day workshop. They'll learn how to maintain a bike in this workshop. At the end of the day, they'll take that bike away to use, and the council will fund that workshop. And my students at York St John, the ones that are on the TESOL programs, they'll go too, and they will, as part of that group, learn how to maintain a bike. And the idea is that, going back to Suresh Kanagaraj and the sort of flat ontologies, there'll be no assumptions, hopefully, about boundaries between languages. So I'm keen for our students to experience the languages that the asylum seekers have brought to York and to benefit from those, and perhaps vice versa, but also to recognise the contribution that the bikes are going to make to this project. So that's where that really starts to challenge my thinking. But I want the contribution of the bikes as objects with agency in this experience of being within this bike workshop. I want the contribution of the bikes to be taken seriously and documented. So I'm working out ways of doing that, and also seeing how those boundaries get drawn all the time, don't they, between right and wrong, clean and dirty, English and not English, bike and person, etc. So I'm keen to sort of observe and document that boundary drawing. So I think that is it. The last couple of points, about this project. It's an opportunity to remain alert to how these boundaries get drawn. I think I've already said that, between ourselves and other objects in our environment, so really trying to push down that sort of post-humanist road, if you like, and how the process of drawing these boundaries creates us and the other objects in ways that might be better or worse for all of us. So pushing on through ontologies and epistemologies, how we know what things are, into ethics, and trying to observe how that boundary drawing has benefits and drawbacks for things, including people, in that context, and asking how can we work ethically with each other and with the objects in our environment, or how can we at least observe and remediate any negative effects of these dividing practices that perhaps we're constantly doing between languages between humans and things. It's kind of going back to English as lingua franca. This is my last point, because if we think of a language, let's say English, or a bike, or a swan, or a research participant, or a research participant, if we think of those things not as different versions of things, so not as different Englishes, for example, not of different versions of English, sorry, but of different things, if we, and not as versions of the same bike, but different bikes in different times and places, then what do we, going back to applied linguistics, what do we do about that? How do we bridge into each other's worlds? What is the lingua franca that we're going to bridge into each other's worlds, or are we destined to be in our own world forever? I don't know, but if we want to journey between these worlds and bridge between them, how can or how does that happen? Okay, all right, so I think that is it for me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand back over to Chanel, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this talk. First, we'll have Dr. Makoni ask some questions, and then we'll open up the floor to everybody. Thanks so much.
Rachel, thank you very much for this. Let me, I want you to help me think through a couple of ideas. And after we've done this joint thinking, I'll hand over to Kim to bring in some of my colleagues. I think I agree with you that data is an active process, that in actual fact, what tends to be overlooked is this datafication processes, the mechanisms by which artifacts are subsequently constructed to become data that we analyze. That I think I agree with you. But that's where this thing becomes interesting for this discussion. What is the implication of data of language as a product of datafication? The implications are this. If language is a product of datafication, then you are led to question the validity of language as a universal ontology. Language then can be a universal category if it is a product of a datafication process. What you will create might be different from what I will create today. What I create today might be different from what I may create tomorrow.
Yeah.
So applied linguistics then gets caught up in a very interesting philosophical problem about the lack of validity universally of the ontology of the entity that it seeks to describe. Yeah, let me stop there, then we can continue on that.
Yeah, yes, datafication is a great phrase, really, really great phrase. And I think you saw that in my slides with the transcript. I didn't talk about transcription, but transcription is a well-known, now I think well understood, isn't it? Part of that datafication process, because what I left out, that's not, it's part of the datafication process, and the selection, the boundary drawing between what's represented and what doesn't, etc., etc. Yeah. So I don't know if how to describe, well, if we're just left with a paradox that we sit with, or if I wonder if what you'd say about the idea of validity is sort of swept away, I'm afraid, with recognition of those datafication processes, and in a post-language world, then validity is one of the concepts that really needs, perhaps this group should do it, but really needs reimagining. Because if we're all, you know, if English is, for example, is lots of different things, then there's validity obviously does apply, implies, sorry, a sort of core, doesn't it? A truth.
Yes.
Against which all of the truths can be measured. But if we're going to go post-language and accept multiple ontologies of things, then yeah, I think it's a really good question. How do we deal with the concept of validity? It feels like unethical maybe to ditch the concept because then we're, I don't know, we're lost, maybe we're, I don't know, tossed on the ocean, an ontological ocean. So how do we steer through that? How do we paddle through? How do we reimagine that concept of validity? I hope.
I thought I would then argue that in such cases, my intellectual intuitions are to argue in the following way: that language is not a separate or separable activity.
Yeah.
Right. The reason why it is not a separable activity is that it cannot possess a determinate ontology on itself. Right. That allows me then to be able to understand why what I may regard as language now might be different from what I may regard as language in the after party or 2-3 hours later on, because what language is whatever I believe it to be. Right. So that's one way of thinking about it. Then the other problem that is there, which I think would be interesting when we open it up to this conversation to our colleagues, is whether, for example, if we had started off with ontologies tied to other languages, whether English would have been different. How we relate to English would have been different if we had started off with Hebrew, Arabic, isiZulu, and other languages and moved that way. In other words, whether the ontologies that we have of English are a legacy of English itself.
I see. Yeah. I see. Yeah. Almost certainly. I mean, that's sort of that archaeology is there, isn't it? So yes, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And to your previous point, I would say that I think what I'm trying to do, I don't know successfully, but is to is instead of trying to sort of decide what language is and where it sits with other semiotic resources, although I'm very drawn, philosophically very drawn to your you know, description of you know, erasing those boundaries between language and other semiotic resources. I'm very drawn to that myself, but because I work with people, other English language teachers, museum conservators, psychotherapists who have very different conceptualizations of English. I want to be able to have a conversation with them.
With them, yes.
Yeah, with them that is participatory, and that you know, as far as I'm able to, which is sometimes not very far, take very seriously their version of what they think things are.
What they think language is. Yes. I see what you mean. But the part that I liked quite a lot about what you were talking about is where you were implying that, for example, communicative practices can be extended to inanimate objects. Right. That I last week I talked a little bit about that as well. That I like quite a lot because it doesn't foreclose the debate.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Because if communicative practices are extended to inanimate objects, then the responsibility is on us to come up with analytical frameworks that enable us to capture and analyze these communicative practices by other inanimate objects, as opposed to saying the only communicative practices that we should focus on are the ones that are used, spoken, and produced by species that we call human beings, which typically in some cases will simply be white men.
Yeah, agreed.
Right. That's why I am more drawn to communicative practices as being produced by inanimate objects, because politically, I'm then able to undercut the argument that says, it basically undercut the notions of standard language.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. It has been really interesting to work with Divine and as a psychotherapist and a person who uses objects in his therapy, and also with Matthew on the museum world, really fascinating world in which, you know, these ideas are really new. You know, the ideas that that so-called inanimate objects have a communicative offer to make, and a voice. That's still pretty new thinking in conservation. So yeah, so just to go back to repeating what I've already said, but just needing so that's what I find, is that I need a way of framing those sort of hooks to put those conversations on. So we put the swan in the middle of that framework, because you know, you can think of this, the swan is this and it's this, it's different swans. It's not just one swan, there's lots of swans. But yes, myself, if I'm to separate myself out, draw a boundary between myself and others, I'm like you, very drawn to that idea of communicative expertise, if you like, of inanimate objects.
Then I'll just make the last point and then hand over to Kim. The interesting thing about your argument about inanimate objects having communicative practices is that it leads us into taking seriously and being aware of the inadequacies of the meta language that we currently have in applied linguistics to carry out the job that we do. It's not so much that we are opposed to the idea that inanimate objects that inanimate objects have communicative potential. It's simply that the meta language that we have is inadequate to carry out the task that we want it to do. Right. That is the issue. So the next phase of all this is the creation of a meta language that enables us to meet and fulfill the requirements of our analytical ambition. That's the way I would tend to think about it. Thank you very much, Rachel. This is fascinating stuff. Let me give you over to Kim, because a lot of my colleagues are waiting to come and talk more sensible things than I'm talking about. Kim.
All right, thank you so much. We have a few questions in the chat box that I'll read out loud, but anybody can feel free to raise their hand, use the raise hand function, or add more questions to the chat. So I'll start with Taboho. He says, thank you to Dr. Wicaksono for the presentation of Ontologies of English. In my mind, as an outsider to linguistics, a political scientist, historian, and Pan-Africanist, I see in my mind parallels of Roman imposition of Latin on Rome's colonial or imperial subjects as a cultural imposition with English and the British colonial influence on its colonies even after their independence. Is this parallel wrong? Is English not leading to death of other languages and culturally responsible for their death?
Thank you, Taboho. Yeah, really interesting question, and great to see the cross-disciplinary nature or transdisciplinary nature of this group. I think that's a real strength of the group. I think yes is the answer to the first part of your question, that English was and still is a cultural imposition through the work of, for example, the British Council, and it continues to be so, I'm sorry to say, through much of the work of the British higher education system, and the tests that are associated with entry into that system, such as IELTS, I suppose TOEFL is the one that we could name that's more relevant in the US context. So yes, those are mechanisms of control, as was the imposition of Latin on the Roman Empire. The answer is yes. I think your parallel, for me, makes total sense. Whether English leads to the death of other languages, that's not really my area, but languages do, death is a sort of human concept, isn't it? So it's a metaphor, obviously, when applied to languages, but languages do, in one sense, die. You know, if small languages where the language doesn't get passed on to the next generation. I don't know, it's because it's not my area, to what extent English is responsible for that, except in the UK, for example, where Cornish, which was a language it's spoken in the Southwest, sort of died out. That almost certainly was to do with English. Around the globe, as all of many of you will know, people take on linguistic resources from a variety of different sources. So I think it's perhaps not so much that big languages are dying, but that they're all changing. And of course, that massively includes English, changing all the time, much to the displeasure of some conservative English people who believe in proper English as it was spoken by their parents or their grandparents. So, but anyway, as linguists know, language is always on the move, and it changes to meet the communicative needs of its speakers as they evolve due to technology and other things. So, so I think sometimes in some small cases, English might be responsible for the death, but it's also changing along with other languages and being changed. Of course, I mean, famously, English was changed by other languages in lots of different ways. So yeah, I think the answer probably is that it's not directly leading to the death of other languages, but that's probably controversial. Please chip in, anybody else?
Yeah, thank you. We might not get a final answer on that one. Arthur Spears also has a question. So many thanks for your stimulating talk. I have a question about a relatively mundane issue. You mentioned that there at St. John's, it was the home students, the local monolingual, usually little traveled first generation students who needed the most attention. What kind of attention? What were the diagnostics indicating that they needed more attention? And what resulted from quote unquote more attention given to those students?
Yeah, really, really interesting question. Yeah, I did say that, but what I was only saying that in a sort of a corrective way, to try to counter or correct the idea that it's the international students that need special remedial attention when they came to our university. That was very much the assumption. So anybody who works in the university in any English-speaking country will be familiar with this, but international students are considered to require an English language test, and then often they'll have special classes in addition to the other sort of content-related classes. And certainly that was the case with the students, the international students that I was working with at York St. John's. So they got the special attention. I mean, attention there was negative, of course, as attention sometimes is, in the sense that it was cost, they had to pay for it, and it took time and time away from the studies of their subject. But so what I was trying to say was to sort of flip that really, and to say that back then in 2010, when I was doing that work, what I realized was that when it came to negotiating understanding, it was in fact often, and I'm obviously generalizing now, but often the international students who were considered by the university system to be deficit in their communicative resources, they were often the ones with the familiarity and with the expertise in navigating understanding. And it was what we call here the home students who were stuck, and who, when I looked at misunderstanding and sort of tracked it back, were the originators. So they did things like extended question sequences. So you would launch a question, get halfway through, relaunch, and then maybe a third time. And for the person that they were talking to, which was an international student, the processing time needed to work out, hang on, is this just all one question? Is it 3 different questions? Sometimes led to, as that cognitive processing was happening, a pause, which would be interpreted by the home students as they don't understand, their English is not good enough, and either give up or, you know, have another go at the question. So. So yeah, attention, not always necessarily a good thing, and we haven't changed our practice, I'm afraid. UK higher education that idea is very entrenched, that international students are the ones that need extra attention, as it were, negative attention. It's very, very difficult to shift that. Perhaps it would sort of crumble the whole of UK higher education if that happened. I don't know. Yeah, I hope that's a little bit clearer.
I was thinking, I had some, I used to teach composition, and I taught undergraduates for a long time. So I had some specific experiences in my career and mine. For example, one of the things I noticed in teaching students in regular classes, in other words, not writing classes, is that the foreign students practically always wrote better than the American-born, local, first generation, et cetera, students. So what was the difference? They knew fundamentals of composition, so to speak. I'll use that term. And they applied it in their native languages, Greek, Ukrainian. We had students from every place in the world. It was a wonderful situation. And they applied those skills that they had learned. I had many Eastern European students to English, and they ended up with much better writings than the students who had grown up 2 blocks away from the college. The foreign students wrote English well in most cases, but there were what we would call grammatical errors, and let's say importation from their native languages. I had studied Slavic language, so it was interesting to see, for example, the errors that the Ukrainian students made when they wrote English. But anyway, the home students who grew up in the same neighborhood that the college was located in had grammatical errors too, from the standpoint of standard US English. Both had errors. One group wrote better than the other group. So what I'm getting at is, it seems that there are language skills that transcend particular languages and particular idiolects, and that you can have the same set of problems, grammatical errors, punctuation errors, and so on and so forth, from students who are home students and also those who are international students. So how do you sort that all out and recognize the strengths of those who are not native English speakers, and I guess we could call them weaknesses within the framework of the schooling system, the weaknesses of the home students, and look at both groups of students from the same perspective. In other words, using the same notions, concepts, frameworks, and so forth for considering both types of students. Can you shed some insight into that? That's just happens to be something I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, Arthur. Thank you for that example. And that really resonates with my experience too, of teaching so-called English for academic purposes in a variety of different places around the world. And then coming back to the UK, into York St John, Widening Participation University, to do that work with the international students who had also had that input in their school system, as your students had too. So they'd had that input. They were socialized into that thinking about what a good essay is, what a good oral presentation is, etc., and often performed very well within that context. And the shock for me, as you just outlined, was that the so-called home students were writing in very different ways. And they were writing in ways which were, interestingly, not valued at all by the higher education system. And that was a big gap. So yes, I very much recognize the situation that you're talking about. I mean, education is a highly normative, full of all sorts of rules and regulations about what good writing is and what good speaking is. And I guess it's probably just as simple as the international students that came to the UK were successful. On the whole, had been very successful in their education, and so had learned those rules, had taken them seriously and learned them, and then were able to apply them when they got to York. And the home students hadn't been so successful on the whole within their education, so they hadn't learned those sort of regulations, those ways of thinking about correctness and clarity and articulateness, which are all social constructs, aren't they? They just hadn't, for all sorts of different reasons, poverty, discrimination, hadn't engaged with that input so much at school, and so came to me, and I thought, oh my goodness, your writing is terrible. Of course, it's not. I wouldn't say that now. It's not terrible. It's just different, and that brings us on to that very difficult question that you just asked: is how do we accommodate difference, and how do we value difference within education? You just asked me a really difficult question. I want to try, and the Bikes project is an effort to at least look at how those boundaries get drawn between what's correct and what's incorrect, what's good and what's bad writing. And within the US, you've got that very strong tradition of work on funds of knowledge, and valuing the contribution, the cultural and the linguistic contribution that students who come to school from all different backgrounds bring, and ways, sort of mechanisms for doing that. But unfortunately, I think it's really hard work that educators will maybe always struggle with, given the sort of normative environment in which education happens, and testing. How we get around testing is really, really, really difficult. Testing is the key, but testing is, well, English language testing makes lots of money. I think I'm afraid it's a business, and it makes money that benefits the British government. So I don't see any shift coming in that regard. The British government will say, I'm pretty sure they need that money, and will continue to extract it. And I'm smiling when I shouldn't, because it's a sort of tragic situation. But anyway, you just asked me the most difficult question, Arthur, about what to do, apart from local kind of activism of constructing projects which observe how these judgments get made and the impact of those judgments on our students' lives. Apart from that, I don't know how policy gets changed, again, outside of my experience. All we can do as individuals is design projects in our classrooms that require multiple experiences, including the objects, the so-called inanimate objects that surround us, that require the contribution of those things, and then shout about them once we've done them, publish them, give presentations about them, etc. So although that's puts the burden back on us, doesn't it, and back on you, Arthur, to do that work, I think for now that's the only answer I've got, is please do that work of valuing multiple a variety of contributions, and then come back and tell us all about how you did it.
How much I wanted to give an example of one solution I worked out. Do we have time, or do?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
We do. Okay. I was teaching Anthropology 101, where we get into evolution, which is a sticking point for many of the home students, because they've, as we say, they've grown up in the church. Their families were religious. They went to the various kinds of churches and things that preach that evolution is wrong and that creationism is right. In other words, God is responsible for all the different objects and species that we see in the world. So I had to teach evolution, and I was running into a wall with them. And some students said, I'm not going to believe what you teach about evolution because that conflicts with my religion. So my issue was, how am I going to get around with that? And I did two things. Number one, I said, you have to take into consideration what the university is doing and what we're doing fundamentally here. We're providing you with skills that will help you in basically the job world. We're helping you to be able to leave this neighborhood surrounding the college and go into other neighborhoods and function well. And that means getting jobs that pay higher and so on and so forth. That's one of the main functions of what we're doing here. Religion versus evolution. One day I got the bright idea. We're talking about discourses, different types of discourses. And I explained to them the difference between the discourse of science and the discourse of religion. And one is based on empiricism, the other is based on faith. And then I explained the difference between faith and empirical study, logic, different discourses. So the discourse of science, why does the university focus on it? It's because of the things it produces. The CDs, the televisions, the motorbikes, the sand bikes, the motorboats, all of these objects. It produces them. And that's why it's important. And then I talked about why religion is important. But that's not what we do here. If you want to do that, that's wonderful, but it's a different kind of institution. So that's just an example of one way that I dealt with that problem, or that issue of how to work with home students, as you labeled them, versus the students who already had these educational institution skills under their belt when they arrive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds really good. I like the appeal to the students' sort of future selves as higher income earners. I imagine that's pretty motivating for some. And then the other sort of more linguistic stroke philosophical approach, which I think is sort of similar to what I'm trying to do here with a framework, an ontological framework. So you described it as more from a linguistic perspective as a discourse. And yeah, so slightly different angle on it, but yeah, basically the same thing, saying that this is your way into understanding what these things are, but these are other possible ways, which you mentioned that sort of the duty of the university, the sort of moral duty of the university to share with you. And then I think the only thing that I'd add on really is the sort of the ethical side of getting the students to think through the benefits and the drawbacks for themselves and how they might get judged. You know, if they're coming at something from one ontological perspective, or one, as you described it, from using one sort of discourse around something like evolution. So your benefits and drawbacks of those different perspectives for themselves, and also for other people that they might come into contact with. And I must say, I found young people at university here very interested in ethical issues as they relate to themselves and other people that they might come across. So that one has been quite productive, I think, for me. And I've had similar conversations, that's not one for us here in the UK, the debate about evolution and intelligent design, but the one that I've had recently is gender and sexuality. So I had a student, a master's student, and I was just chairing her oral examination, but she said in the oral examination that she was talking about trans related issues, and her project had been to research the views, I think, of trans students who identify as trans. And she said very categorically in the exam, only trans people have the right to research the experiences of other trans people. And so that was really interesting, quite sort of provocative but interesting perspective. And I think we as staff in the university tried to peel her slightly back from that in the way that you've done, Arthur, by saying the job of the university is maybe to look at what things are or what issues are from a range of different perspectives, and then consider the benefits and drawbacks. So yeah, that sounds like pretty similar experience to the one that you've had. Yeah. Do you think it worked when you suggested those, when you did those activities? Were they successful?
I think it was a smashing success.
That's all that matters.
Now, you could go back and ask the students, but I think it really cleared the air, and many of the students were, for better or worse, highly consumerist.
Okay.
So when I talked about science providing TVs and Lexuses and Mercedes and all the cars that they wanted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you know, bells were ringing, and I think
dollar signs appeared in their eyes. Good.
Ringing,
well,
unfortunately, you know.
Well, so what, you know, working out what motivates is an important part of teaching, isn't it? Yeah, how to get our students to listen to us.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I see Musna's hand, but I also saw Ashraf's hand a little earlier. I don't know, Ashraf, if you still have a question or comment.
Thank you so much. I actually had a question that was raised by Majda, but later I came to form another question. It's a very small question. It's about Hall's ontological framework. The framework here defines language capacity, as you said, as the capacity of the human, right, to use language. But this is, again, this is a liberal ontological framework. It's not a materialist ontological framework. We're back again to the humanist traditional understanding of language capacity. That's one point. The second point, the framework itself which you used in the analysis of this one, the object is conceptualized again as something acted on. So my question is, where's the definition? How the definition of object as something that has agency is not reflected in the in the framework which you used. For example, the table, the object as a process, contingent object which is produced by its observers. For the cognitive, to understand the meanings that have been assigned to the object by individuals. So the object is, where is the agency here for the object, the non-human agency? Thank you.
Gosh, both really good questions, Ashraf. Thank you. I'll have a go, and forgive me if it's not a very convincing answer. I think the ontological framework was designed to try and map a range of ontological commitments to what language is. So a bit like Arthur and I were saying, these are not necessarily all commitments that we share, but they are commitments that we've come across in our in our reading, in our teaching, in our research. So one of those commitments, as you rightly say, is that is to the idea that language is the thing. The language capacity is the thing that makes humans different from all other animals. And I guess the reason for mapping those commitments was, as I said, and also in dialogue with Arthur, is to create a way into a conversation about what English or what language or what things are, to create a way into that conversation. When we're sort of, I don't know, another mapping metaphor, but when we're moving across a map to different places to try and work out what the conceptualization of a thing or a language or English is in that place. And then again, like the dialogue we just had with Arthur, maybe to then sort of explore other ways to open up or create some kind of lingua franca, some kind of shared language for thinking about what language is. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the first part of your question. It's a map. Maps are all selections, aren't they? Always selections, and we've talked about datification. In the same way, maps are selections, and often the interesting bits are the bits which are left out. And that's probably almost certainly the case with this ontological framework that Chris developed. There's lots of interesting bits that have been left out. So that, I think, is the first part. And the second part about the swan, yes, I see what you mean with that. I'm just looking at that now. You're absolutely right. The emphasis is on the swan as a sort of passive object, which is not where our thinking was. Certainly by the end of that piece that we wrote. I think it's certainly where, as far as I can see, sort of thinking in museums is. Objects get stuff done to them, they get meanings assigned to them, they get promoted as our best object or demoted and moved into a different part of the museum, the children's room, or into the basement where the so-called broken things are or worthless things are. So that the idea that objects have agency, I think, is, like I said, sort of pretty new one, and maybe we weren't particularly successful in representing that on the on that framework, which I'm just looking at now to see whether I can defend it. I'm not sure that I can. Yeah, except to say, you know, the idea of the permanent object, we've sort of hedged that by saying it's widely believed to be static, preservable, and somehow authentic. So I guess there's a small hedge in there to add a little bit of challenge into the idea, into that assumption that objects are static, preservable, authentic. I think it's a good question, Ashraf, and I think me and Matthew are going to have to go back to that. If you get a chance to read the article, the questions that we suggest that come off this framework. So the framework was sort of a prompt for dialogue, cross museum dialogue and with visitors. So maybe the questions are a little bit more successful in recognizing that the objects themselves have agency and certainly have a part to play in the discussion. So if you get time, please have a look at the actual article. Maybe the question's a bit more successful, but I'll go back to Matthew and have a think about that. Thank you so much for that comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump to Magda's questions because it's related, and then Musna, I will call on you. Okay, so Magda says, thank you for sharing your research. You mentioned several times that you were fascinated by what this thing English was. I'm interested in learning more about your view on the power of things, or the thingness as elaborated by the new materialist theorist Jane Bennett. How does this conceptualization of things-based ontology relate to the ontological framework from Hall that you presented today?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question, Magda. Thank you so much. The power of things is a really interesting phrase, isn't it? Divine, who is the psychotherapist that I was working with, talks a lot about and writes a lot about power with rather than power over in that sort of therapeutic relationship, which I always thought was very interesting and relates to material objects too, such as objects in museums, power with rather than power over. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the work of Jane Bennett, so that's a very useful tip. I'll go away and if you can suggest anything specific, that'd be great. Otherwise I'll do an internet search for her work. On new materialism, the writers that I've been trying to grapple with are ones that you'll also have come across. So work of the history of science scholar and feminist Karen Barad. So I've been trying to grapple with her ideas about what objects are. And I think somebody else has mentioned in the chat about how things get created in intra-action, she talks about, doesn't she, rather than inter-action. So not that their meanings are not pre-established, but they get created and in a sort of dynamic way in specific contexts. Those boundaries get drawn, those dividing practices happen in specific contexts. So, but thank you. If you have chance to put in the chat anything specific by Jane Bennett that you think would be useful, I'd be really grateful. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Musna, go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I would like to join Arthur's dialogue and maybe take it to outside of English-speaking countries and consider how speakers of other languages who, on the one hand, are obliged to learn English in order to get an entrance ticket to the university or to other job markets, and on the other hand, their conceptualizations of English is basically entangled within socio-political and ideological constraints due to kind of the tension between the role of English as a global language on the one hand and there being speakers of other languages on the other. So, for example, I have been studying the ideological and the hegemonic role of English when it comes to teaching English to speakers of Arabic in Israel. So to whom English is a fourth language, it could be considered a fourth language. If we take the diagnostic situation of Arabic, and then they're having to study Hebrew as a third language, and then for them, English comes as a fourth language. And so, as I said, within the socio-political complexity of the multilingual context of Israel in terms of the languages and the tension between languages, so it seems that English is playing a very kind of diverse role. So on the one hand, to some students, it seems that English is functions as a framework of voice, where learning English is motivated by this an interest or this desire to speak up and get a voice, because Arabic does not give these speakers, these colonized speakers, a voice. So English seems to give them, on the one hand, a framework of voice and enables them to tell their story or to negotiate their identity, or maybe also kind of to decolonize their subjectivities as, colonized subjects. But on the other hand, I have also seen that English can play out as, a neo-colonial force, in the sense that it fortifies surveillance, in the sense that when you are afraid, or when you feel that if you speak in Arabic, that would risk your position, then you will revert to English, because it kind of reduces the risk. If we kind of draw upon Pavlenko's work on the effect of the foreign language. So it seems that English reduces the risk of talking about risky or kind of precarious topics in a complex and in a conflict-ridden context such as Israel. So it's more than sharing a thought from, hearing what you have been saying, but it's like, I think that the conceptualization of English in such complex and troubled educational context, requires even an extended level of theorization to consider how these students, and considering, I think, their loci of enunciation, where they are speaking from when they try to conceptualize the role of English. So I think that these ontologies of English need also to be kind of theorized from a global, from a southern perspective of these non-hegemonic speakers of English. So I wonder whether how this kind of reading of how English is used in other, English-speaking countries or outside of the English-speaking countries, how these ontologies, what kind of theorization we can also speak about when we talk about ontologies of English. Thank you.
Gosh, that sounds like really fascinating work, Musna. Really fascinating and very much needed, but complex work that you're doing. So please carry on with doing that work. It sounds really good. The link between ontology and ideology, which I think is sort of the basis of your question, is a very interesting one. And very relevant in your context, obviously, but also in a lot of other, in an educational context. I think sort of Arthur touched on that too. And we see that here also in the so-called national curriculum, where certain versions of English, which would fall in sort of the N language conceptualization of English as normed, national, native, so certain versions of English that are based on those types of ontological commitments to what language is, are very powerful and very disadvantaging for many students, including a lot of the students that come to York St John who failed English language tests at school. And I guess, the connection there with ideology is as you are suggesting, is or partly suggesting is repression and preservation of the status quo by the people who already hold the power, by judging other communicative resources as inadequate and in need of extra work. My colleague Chris Hall and Claire Cunningham, both at York St John, they've written about something might be relevant to your work. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like from ontology to ideology and back. And I think what they're doing is exploring that connection between ontologies and ideologies, judgments, power, all of those kind of ideological perspectives on what things are. And they're doing that within the English school system, testing, failure, etc. Multilingual pupils are often judged as insufficient or inadequate when it comes to English and in need of extra teaching. So if you get a chance, you could look up Chris and Claire Cunningham, Ontology to Ideology and back. And I mean, it sounds like you've got your sort of conceptual framework really nicely and usefully mapped out. I guess you could look at, if you wanted to, that ontological framework of language and sort of use that also as a lens through which to try and sort out these conceptualizations of what language is, particularly in these highly charged contexts that you're working in, and that may or may not be a useful thing to do. It might not add very much, but you could, if you wanted to, have a think about the sort of underpinning assumptions behind those ideological judgments about language use, the ontological assumptions that underpin those ideologies, and maybe add that as another layer to sort of explain or just describe what's going on. It sounds like you don't need it. It sounds like the work's totally fascinating, but I guess it just adds another lens, doesn't it, to work that you're already doing. But please carry on. It sounds amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few more comments in the chat box, but Mari also has a follow-up question to her comments. So Mari.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I was thinking about Karen Barad interaction, and I was wondering, rather than thinking about object having agency, if you take like Jim Bennett or Karen Barad's position, it's really sort of like configuration of different, not entities, but different things jointly produce energy, right? How does that, so agency is distributed across participants rather than each individual or object having agency. What do they do together? So that sort of like, that's, so I sort of get Ashraf's point, because so, how does one work with people? Like how, when people look at SWAN, what do they produce? So I just thought, you thought about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mari. Thank you, and thanks for developing Ashraf's point. Your sort of agency is distributed, which is what you said, wasn't it? But sort of collaborative, flat, I suppose. I mean, it has been really interesting to talk, or a bit mind-bending for me, but to talk to Matthew, who's the conservator, about tools. That conversation is not, it's obviously not the first time that conversation's been had. Philosophers have been thinking about tool use for many decades, and the sort of the boundaries that we draw between a tool and the user of the tool, where the important break is it between the sort of end of the tool and the surface on which the tool is working, or is it the hand, the human hand, and the tool, and different ways in which we sort of conceptualize the status of maker and tool, and the distributed agency, distributed cognition even, that is present in those types of environments, maybe all of our environments, but it's, you know, particularly maybe noticeable in those types of environments. Certainly Matthew, I know, has a deep love for his tools and spends a lot of time looking at them, in dialogue with them, thinking about them and their contribution to the work that he does. That's a serious part of his practice. So I mean, that is, as I think I said to Ashraf, I mean, maybe we've just got so far with that thinking, but with your help today in collaboration with this group and with a bit more reading of Jane Bennett, for example, I would really like to be better at noticing how and documenting how agency is distributed, how it's collaborative between all of the objects, including the maker, the human, in those types of environments. I think it seems like a really you know, interesting thing to do. And I know nothing about artificial intelligence, so I probably shouldn't even mention it, but you know, it seems like we're going to have to take very seriously now how that happens, you know, how those boundaries get drawn between what we might have described as robots or as you know, sort of slightly dismissively in the past. We're going to have to take much more seriously how those dividing practices take place between all sorts of different types of objects, and the benefits and drawbacks for all of the objects, including the things we think of as humans in that environment. So I think it's maybe pretty urgent work. And I'm glad to be talking about it today. So thank you very much, yeah, for that question and that reading. Let's all go and do it. If there's a film made about artificial intelligence, let's hope there's a linguist or an applied linguist is the hero of that film and not a computer scientist, because these are the types of questions that we're all thinking about now, aren't we? You know, at least these are the implications of the questions. So yeah, let's hope, if anyone's writing that script, that film script at the moment, that they'll cast a applied linguist in that in the main role. Yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to thinking more about those questions. So thank you very much for those really interesting questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap it up there. So if we can give the floor over to Dr. Makoni again for some closing comments. We can also keep the discussion going afterwards in our party.
Just two quick comments. Karan Barad will be presenting to us sometime in the course of the year. I can't remember the date, but it will be interesting to listen to her when she's presenting to us.
Amazing.
And then, yeah, it will be interesting. We will remember your presentation quite a lot when we listen to her. And then what is interesting, I think, about issues about objects is that it's not only the objects, but it is in some cases, it is the relationship between the objects that may be more important than the objects themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe that's all we've got is relationships. Maybe that's where we've gone wrong. It's a 20th century conceptualization of objects. and I think she writes about that too, as things, you know, thingification of everything, where, yes, it'll be fascinating to hear what she says about relationships.
Yes.
That's maybe where we need to turn our attention now.
Yes, it's possible. That's where we need to turn. Because methodologically, also in terms of research, is that what the positivist framework has tended to do is to emphasize, or how do you select particular, let's say, informants, etc. How do you create your sample? But it hasn't been, the emphasis hasn't been so much on the nature of the relationship between these different entities, or yourself as the applied linguist and the individuals that you are dealing with. Because for the applied linguists, unlike other social sciences or humanities, you learn as much about language from analyzing composition of the students, right? Whereas if you are a physicist, I don't think your notion of waves changes radically by analyzing waves, but your notion of language, because you cannot analyze language outside language. So your language is influenced by the language that you are analyzing as well in that process. And you cannot get out of it. There's the paradox of it all, you can't get out of it. Okay, thank you very much about it. Let me give you back to Kim to tell us who is coming next. Right.
Oh, I got that.
Oh, you've got it.